Welcome to my channel. My name is Medic Muffin. Those of you in the Chivalry 2 community probably know me better as the Polax. What most of you probably don't know is that I play this game on controller, and today I'm here to share a few tips and tricks with the community because while there are a couple of guides floating around, they strike me as very much incomplete. My intention, if you can forgive the poor production value of the first video I've ever edited together, is to share a complete and comprehensive guide to using a controller in Chivalry. I will cover everything from a not-so-secret console rebinding method to settings to a little bit of theory behind why I make the recommendations that I make. For anyone who may doubt my credentials, I have been playing this game on a controller since before there was an official controller scheme. I started in the very early alpha rounds when I had to set all of my binds from scratch, and I quite immediately had an issue when they did finally implement a default control scheme. So in the intervening years, I like to think I've picked up some tips and tricks. I used them when I started on console, and I have continued to use them on PC. And today, I plan to share them with you. Now, before I get into the meat as far as console rebinding goes, I'm going to quickly take a moment to point out that yes, I am on PC, and I do have the choice to rebind some things through the game options. That said, I do not make use of this because a number of inputs are hard-coded and cannot be changed no matter what you do. Believe me, I have tried everything down to messing with the INI files that govern the controller settings within the game. Any real changes, unfortunately, will have to come from the devs within the actual game code. Now, all that being said, there is one other method I know of to rebind your controls, and this method is available to console players as well. So if you are on Xbox, this can be done through Xbox accessories in your apps list. You may need to go to the store and download it if it's not already there. If you're on PlayStation, you can find this option under your accessibility settings and then under the controller option. So I will be using Xbox accessories as my example here, but the functionality is pretty much identical for PlayStation, with the only real difference being the user interface. So the core idea here behind what we're doing is that instead of changing anything with the game itself, we use the software to alter the controller and how it reports physical inputs to the system. So in the case of my personal binds, I have changed my left bumper to input a right stick click, which means that when you see my right stick light up on the overlay, I'm actually pressing left bumper. My right bumper, in turn, is mapped to my left bumper, and my right stick click is mapped to my right bumper hidden behind the overlay here. In practical terms, this means that right stick click is my stab, right bumper is my overhead, and left bumper controls my jabs and crouching. This is a reasonably close imitation of how Chivalry 1 was set up for controller, and it happens to be my personal preference. That said, I do recommend experimenting and changing things around and, just seeing what works for you and what doesn't. I did go through a few iterations of this before I settled on what you see now, so everybody has to figure out what works best for them. Now, there are some caveats to this, such as menu navigation. Depending on where you bind your bumpers to, you're going to be pressing weird buttons to tab around left and right in the menus. Whether you're just wanting to change some settings or you want to go to customization or jump back to matchmaking or whatever you may want to do through the menus. That said, I think this is a pretty small and fast adjustment to make, at least it was for me, and the gameplay benefits, in my opinion, far outweigh any weirdness with navigating menus or weird throw inputs because we know how throws work already. At the end of the day, it's worth just sticking with, I think, and figuring it out a little bit. You have to unlearn some things as you figure out your new binds. So stick with it, see what works, and enjoy your newfound input freedom. Now, the next topic is going to be sensitivity, specifically your sensitivity settings and what all they do And of course, I am going to tell you all about that look response style. Now, I would argue that these are your most important settings, so do not sleep on this, because it's actually very important. Now, as regards sensitivity specifically, I'm going to break this portion into two parts. There is going to be a basic portion and an advanced portion. The basics, of course, begin with your actual sensitivity values. I'm not going to make any specific recommendations here as far as numbers go. I clearly run it maxed out, but different things work for different people. The only real hard and fast rule here is that you have to be able to hit your turn caps. Beyond that, it is really just personal feel, although I will say higher is generally better. For people who are running default sensitivity, or especially anything under 3.0, I strongly recommend that you start to raise your sensitivity values by 1 to 3 points every few matches until you either top out at 5.0 or until you simply cannot play the game because the look speed is too fast for you. Focus sensitivity is archer bullshit. I'm not even going to justify it with an explanation. Now, left and right stick dead zones is pretty simple. A dead zone, for those who don't know, is simply a measure of how far from center you have to push your stick until it registers an input. Now, this value should be as low as possible because it gives you the full range of motion of your analog stick, and it makes things a little bit more reactive. The reason for this is because if you set a very high dead zone, and say 50% as an extreme example, what you end up having to do is push the stick quite far to register small movements. When you're trying to play the game, this tends to just look very twitchy and robotic as compared to a much finer dead zone in which I can move and look very precisely. And I can still move very fast as well. Now, trigger dead zones are more or less the same concept. You want these as low as possible because as a measure of how far you have to pull the trigger in order to register an input, you want it to be doing that as fast as possible because these are your block and slash buttons. So barring any sort of hardware issues with your controller that is causing unwanted inputs on the trigger or either of the sticks, these values should all be set to their minimums. Now, aim assist, I typically recommend people turn it off, but I believe most people eventually gravitate towards doing that anyways. You really just don't want the game having any control over how you swing your camera, because swing manipulation is very, very important for this game. And that about covers the basics, so for those of you who don't care to hear anything more about this, you can go ahead and skip to the next section. For those of you sticking around for the advanced portion, I am going to cover all things look response style. Now, this is something that in my experience is probably the most confusing option to most people. There seems to be almost no understanding within the community about what this is, how it works, or what the various different options do. So the broad overview is that look response style is just a different way of saying sensitivity curve. A sensitivity curve is simply a measure of how your turn speed maps to your right stick as it's pushed farther away from the center. So using linear as an example, you can see the description says it is a one-to-one mapping. What that means is if you press your stick 50% of the way from center, you will achieve 50% of your maximum turn speed as determined by your sensitivity. This is pretty much the standard option for games before it became popular to allow players to change this option. So for most people, I would imagine this feels pretty much normal as a baseline. So it is perfectly functional. There are no outstanding issues with it. It is pretty much your bread and butter. Now, that being said, I consider exponential to be a better option. The reason for that is because exponential is, I will say for simplicity's sake, a 2-to-1 mapping, although be aware I don't know the actual values as relates to Chivalry specifically. But at a 2-to-1 value, that would mean if you push your stick 50% of the way from center, you will achieve only 25% of your maximum turn speed. In practical terms, this allows for a lot more precision and fine aim with small stick movements, and because all sensitivity curves top out at 100%, it doesn't have any real effect on my ability to spin around or do anything generally that requires a high sensitivity value. Now, this is my personal use, and it is what I recommend for everybody else, but of course, mileage will vary. Moving on to dynamic. This is something I'm not a personal fan of, but I can see some situations where it might be useful. Now, the in-game description here is pretty accurate. It has a fast mapping on the low and top ends and is very linear through the middle. In practice, I think it tends to be very twitchy, and it's hard to make fine aim adjustments or be precise using this look response style. But that being said, I can see it being useful if you run a lower sensitivity, if for whatever reason you can't handle the highest values. Dynamic will give you a pretty noticeable boost to your initial turn speed at the cost of some precision. So, again, it's not for me, but I can see some cases where this would be useful for other people. Now, you might have noticed I skipped right over standard, and there is a good reason for that. Now, standard is, I believe, bugged because, as I will demonstrate momentarily, when you look to the left, there are random slowdowns that apply, as opposed to simply staying at the maximum value. You can see I'm not turning anywhere close to my maximum speed here, even though my stick is pressed all the way. And this seems to happen more or less at random. So in practical terms, this just introduces a lot of inconsistency and weirdness into your camera control. And that, of course, is the exact opposite of what you want. So I would normally not tell people to not use something, but I'll make an exception in this case. Do not use standard. Use one of the other three options. They are all perfectly good. They do not suffer from this problem, and you will get a lot farther in this game using anything but standard. I was going to include a section in this guide that was going to go over everything related to combat and actual gameplay, but unfortunately, we are already running pretty long here, so that will have to be a separate video if people find this one to be useful and informative. So I will finish this out by just answering some questions that I fielded from the community before I began this project. Now, I actually only got 2 questions that were not addressed elsewhere in this guide, so I will quickly answer those and leave you with some gameplay just to demonstrate how well my binds and my settings work for me. So the first question is specifically related to having different X and Y values for your sensitivity. Now, for this, I will say it's not for me personally. I think it feels weird, but I've been told by other people that it helps them to have a lower vertical sensitivity for countering overhead specifically. Now, there is value in being able to look up and down very rapidly, especially while swinging a weapon or under any other situation that would apply a turn cap. But really, this is why I said the only hard and fast rule is being able to hit your turn caps. I recommend experimentation in pretty much everything because really I can't tell you what will work or not work for you, and you can't tell yourself what's good or bad until you actually try it. So don't be afraid of changing things because it might make you play bad or whatever. We're all going to have bad games from time to time, regardless. So you might as well use those bad games to figure things out and make yourself a better player, whether that is from developing your skills or because you are trying to optimize your settings for your personal use. The other question that I got was more or less asking about if movement is better on controller, which is a fair question because an analog stick would theoretically give you 360 degrees of movement as compared to simply the 8 directions that you would get from WASD. Sadly, this is not the case for Chivalry. We do not have full analog movement, so the ways that we can move in terms of actual mechanics are identical to PC players. And that is about all the time we have for this video. Now, I'm not in this for the content creation game, but I would appreciate a like, and if you find this guide useful, I would appreciate you sharing it around because I just want to spread information. So if you find it useful, let me know. If you'd like to see a controller-related combat guide or gameplay tips or anything like that, let me know in the comments. And of course, if you have any extraneous questions, feel free to ask those in the comments as well. Until next time, I just want you to remember 2 things for me. Archers are all cucks, and you should be playing more Polax.